Hello, hello, everyone. This is Gavin Lawrence with American Players Theater. Welcome to this episode of In the Wake of Our Shadow, Black Voices. Carlyle Brown is a playwright, performer, curator, and artistic director of Carlyle Brown and Company in Minneapolis. His plays have been produced at theaters across the country and internationally. He's an alumnus of New Dramatists and a lifetime core writer at the Playwright Center. He's received numerous commissions, fellowships, and awards, including the 2006 Black Theater Network's Winona Lee Fletcher Award for Outstanding Achievement and Artistic Excellence, a 2009 Guggenheim Fellowship, a 2010 Otto Rene Castillo Award for Political Theater, a 2010 United States Artist Fellowship, and a 2018 William Inge Award for Distinguished Achievement in the American Theater, along with the 2019 Helen Merrill Award. A scholar and historian, Carlyle Brown has been an artist in residence or visiting professor at several colleges and universities, and he has worked as a museum exhibit writer and story consultant. He curated the 2018 Cultural Diaspora Residency at the Camargo Foundation in Cassis, France, and the Afro-Atlantic Playwrights Festival at the Playwright Center in July of 2019. His solo shows include The Fulla from America, An African Journey, Therapy and Resistance, and Acting Black, Demystifying Racism, created to inspire open and honest conversations about race and diversity. Woo! And that's only part of it. There's so much more. This is such a humble biography. I couldn't even begin to list the amount of different plays this man has written and had produced around the country. But Carlyle Brown, welcome to In the Wake of Our Shadow, Black Voices. I'm very grateful that you've taken some time to spend with us, and it's almost like a homecoming for me, just because we go so far back. And I
Yeah,
think at one point, a writer had written that you are my muse.
yeah.
So welcome. How are you, man?
Oh, thank you. I'm doing fine. I'm doing fine. It's great to be here. Great to be talking to you. And
Yeah. How's
yeah,
life in
congratulations.
Minneapolis?
Huh?
How's
How's
life
life
in
in
Minneapolis these days?
Well, I mean, it's sort of, it is what it is. This is the center of George Floyd and, the Chauvin trial. So it feels very, those of us who have in contact with it, those things feel very present to us at the moment. And so,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh,
I hear you. I hear you. So, just for our audience members who may not be that familiar with you and your work and your life, can you share a little bit about where you were born, where you grew up, and how, if at all, that influenced your direction into the world of writing?
Well, for writers, I mean, like, everything is material, and certainly, your life. You know, um, I was born in Charleston, South Carolina. My people are, Geechees, Gullah people. From the Sea Islands, and so I guess what was really important with in my family was that I don't know what people know much about, like Gullah people, but um, the Europeans didn't really know how to cultivate rice. And, when they cultivated rice, they, in the slave trade, they intentionally went to the grain coast to look for, people who had, done that for, many generations, So the people that came from came to America from Africa that ended up in the Carolinas became those cultures that, and because the Carolinas are the the marshlands of the Carolinas, which are good for rice to grow, are just mosquito infested places.
Hmm.
And so the landowners the plantation owners were generally absentee, right? Which allowed these Africans to retain, some of their Africanness, their cultures, part of the language, which is sort of nurtured and celebrated, in places like Charleston to this day. And so I grew up with, the idea of an African identity as sort of like a thing that was taken for granted. Like, when I was a kid, people spoke Gullah in the house and that sort of thing. And so consequently, they were also like very political, when they moved north. And my grandfather, he was, so I guess it has to do a lot with, my view of this curating, this Afro-Atlantic culture thing, because their view of what it was to be African was not totally African American, right? So they were attracted to Marcus Garvey and whatever, that their idea of the world was not just Negroes in America, that it was a singular struggle, that the struggle was something that went on all around the African basin. So I guess in some ways I would say that was sort of the basis of my identity. I heard that political dialogue at home all the time, and those stories and those manner of storytellings and those well, from Guyana. I mean, those ideas about family and sort of whatever. I mean, it's difficult to explain, but it's a kind of a broader lens. It's a little different lens in terms of how one perceives identity in terms of Africanness.
I hear you. And when in your growth did you decide that writing was going to be your vocation? Did you make that choice? Did it find you? Like, when did that start happening for you?
Well, I guess it was, again, those things. It was really storytelling, right? Of course, there was reading and stuff like that. I mean, my mother was a file clerk, and my grandfather was like a superintendent in a building. So it wasn't like that they were like, they were intellectuals or anything, but they were well read, and they were just always. There were always these arguments about, Black life, and they were just sort of like filled with like, nuances. Like my grandfather, who was a Garveyite, right, and he was my step grandfather, not really a paternal grandfather. His son, was a Black Muslim, right? And those two guys used to argue all the time as if those two things were like radically different. You know what I mean? And so it was like filled with nuance, and intellectual thoughts. And like it was one thing, it was a community of people in diaspora. I grew up with people in Charleston, that carried all those sort of Africanist notions, even if they weren't aware of it, around the table. And my grandmother was sort of the matriarch of that community, and um, so it was like about storytelling. There's people telling stories all the time and arguing and talking with each other, and you better know what you're talking about, and and they played, bid whist, so there was this like sort of vibrant, particularly verbal, um, articulate world in which, enjoyed debate and discussion and that sort of thing. You
And so
know.
were you writing as a child, or did you start that
Well,
later?
well, yeah, I did like some precocious things, like, I don't know, when I guess maybe I was 12 or something, like, I attempted to write like a novel or whatever. I grew up in Washington Heights, and of course there was like the library. I don't know, like, every writer must tell the story about how they discovered the library. It's like almost tedious, but it's true. I mean, it happened to me. I sort of like, discovered the library in some ways, was a voracious reader, just for the pleasure of reading. And of course, I was an only child. And I was subject to daydreaming. I could like live in my mind 24/7. You know what I mean? It's just sort of like imagining things. And then I grew up in an era which was, I'm sure this had some influence, subliminally, but in areas where like radio moved over to television.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And I remember like listening to those things like, the dark shadows. And of course, the writing on those shows are like really imagistic. And it was like, really, really good and quite fascinating. So I certainly remember that. And like TV, of course, didn't quite capture that, but there was of course, it was TV, you're interested in it, and um, the thing I remember most about the TV when I was a kid, geez, I'm just explaining what an old son than I am. But the thing, like about the TV, when I think about like influence about writers and narratives, was that my grandfather was a super of a building in Washington Heights, like a middle class building. So like we were almost like middle class, right? I mean, like, we sort of like lived in the basement, but like, when I was little, we came up from Charleston and we stayed with my grandfather and my grandmother, right? And there's in this apartment. And uh so it was like an integrated neighborhood, right? And so the kids in the neighborhood were like all kinds of kids, a couple of Chinese kids, there were Jewish kids, there were kids from like, Argentina. But New York then, when you went to school, was very, you know, ethnically segregated, like people, ethnic groups congregated together when they went to school. And there were like a lot of gangs, right? And there were like a lot of these conflicts were sort of ethnic. Um, but the kids in my neighborhood were all kinds of kids. We couldn't really associate with each other when we went to school, right? So ethnic conflict was like kind of a game, right? You know what I mean? That we sort of like had to play. So like, you know, if Carlos was in the hallway and I was like walking down there with the brothers and stuff, we would try to like jostle with each other. You know what I mean? It's sort of like, and then just go back home and just like play together. You know what I mean? So I think that sort of construct, that sort of notion of yeah, that notion of a construct was something that was sort of clear to me as a young kid from day to day. So, as I look at the world and as I look at writing in terms of, establishing certain notions with characters and stuff.
Now, did you study writing in college? Or did you run track? Didn't you tell me you ran track? You got a
Well, yeah, I
scholarship?
went to school. Yeah, I ran track and I got a scholarship, and I went to a black college, and and then I stayed there a year and I transferred to NYU, and I was like a journalism. Well, yeah, somewhere in there, I had decided I wanted to be a writer. Right. I don't. Yeah, it was. I don't know. I guess I was pretty serious about it, like early on. So I can't really say where, but all those trips to the library, all that daydreaming, it like kind of ends up on paper. I couldn't say, anything, like a specific
Right.
moment. But by the time I was in school, I wanted to be a writer, and so I was, doing a lot of reading and deciding on, what I want to do. And then of course, there was, the civil rights movement.
Right.
So um, so yeah, that in terms of like what I was going to be, that sort of took precedent over sort of like being a writer. I sort of like kind of morphed into being an activist. I mean, I was a president of the student association at NYU, And so we're talking like towards the um, late 60s, like around 68. I think the end of the civil rights movement was like a very inconclusive ending, right? That it had morphed into the Black Power movement, and society, or I should say more specifically, the government, um, as some parts of the government feel now, that Black franchisement was a national security threat.
Threat.
Yes, was a national security threat. And we're talking about the days of like, the Chicago Seven, Fred Hampton, all over the place. I mean, they were hunting Black people down. They were, organizations were being infiltrated. Martin Luther King, right, was under surveillance by the FBI kind of all those years. It was like sort of concentrated, and it affected a lot of people's lives, certainly mine and, my friends and colleagues, and that whole atmosphere that that we talk about in Are You Now or Have You Ever Been? Who do you trust? Who's who? And
Right.
and how do you defend yourself? And how do you respond to the world when you discover that you've been designated as the enemy of the state?
Hmm. Hmm. Wow. So you also, many of our viewers probably don't know, worked as a seaman. You sailed the world, right?
No, well, I don't know. That would be an exaggeration. I,
Is
I
that an
didn't sail the world,
exaggeration?
but it's I don't know. What are you, a
What
historian or
what
something?
what
Because
took
it
you to
really,
sailing? What took you to that life?
the same thing that you're talking about, that the Contro program that was like, just entrapping people, taking people kind of off the streets, you know, um, it occurred to me, it was also around the time of the draft, I resisted that, I got a 4F for being manic, depressive, schizophrenic. So, there was sort of like, I was certainly no big deal, but I was an activist. But there was, if there was a list, I figured there's really a good chance I would be on it, right? So Lauren, my baby's mama, she and I just get married and got pregnant, and I, in terms of what was going around me, it looked like I need to get out of Dodge, and so like I said, my grandfather's son, I guess you would call him my cousin or whatever, was a Black Muslim, and out of that network, came like a solution to the problem of like how I had no idea where to go, or sort of like, and so um, this this gentleman, this Muslim man, Lukman, who my son is named after, he suggested that he had a connection and outward bound, and he had like an intuitive sense that it would be something that I was good at it. And outward bound was this sea school off the coast of Maine, like on an island. And if they were gonna, I would take a course, and they were gonna give me a try, and then they would like take me on, right? Based on Lukman's work. So that's that's how that that's how that got started.
How long did you do that?
Well, that morphed into like, me being a sailor, and a mate on 19th century, sailing vessels, and eventually like a captain license, and so that part of my life went on for 20 years, less
20
than 20.
years.
Yeah.
And were you writing during that time also?
Well, when I could, it was like, a long, it was a long time to do it. I mean, like when I was in school, when I was in NYU, I was like, well, everybody was like writing poetry, like, revolutionary for it. But I took it pretty seriously, and I was, but anyway, to the point there was that, like, yes, I was writing, but not really in a kind of a concentrated way, because it's running those shifts is a 24/7 job, you know, and you know after the day's over, you have a shot and a beer and lay down, but eventually I kind of managed to, uh, well, what happened was that, like, I I mean, something inside me, like, I want to be a writer, right? So I was always like thinking about stories or scenarios and stuff like that. And this daydreaming thing started to get in the way of, my paying attention to my job, which was, likewise, it's as much as there's lots of and technical skills and stuff like that, but, like, sailing on these boats is an intuitive job. You have to really open yourself up to, um, being able to have some exactitude about things you feel, right? Like for example, I used to work on a boat, the Pioneer, in sort of the East River, where the currents are like, at South Street Seaport Museum, where the currents are just like, totally crazy on this steel schooner, flat bottom, didn't really have like enough power. I mean, it had to really, somehow join forces with the elements to make it work. And it was something that I got pretty good at, and I think that was sort of the part of that was kind of, um, when I started out with Bound to try to make me succeed, was there was something about me, or something that sort of intuitive information I could trust and, like, sort of like, translate. I don't really know how to talk about it. But like I said, for an example, like, you know you're on a boat, and it's, the deck, it's like, uh oh, like 65 to 75 feet between you and the front of the boat, right? And then you're coming to the dock, and there's some guy, your mate, who wants to tell you how far away that is, the dock is, you know. So he says, I say, how far? And he says, 10 feet, Cap, right? You know, now what the hell does that mean, 10 feet, right? I mean, him up there, 10 feet, what does that mean, right? And sort of like, with some sort of exactitude when you go there, well, it's, after a while, it's really about a kind of an understanding about, you can't see what he sees, but you sort of have to sort of trust it, just sort of like kind of compute it. So how you put all of that stuff together is just really intuitive. If something in your mind tells you that's wrong, or it's further than that, or kind of whatever. I mean, that along with your, regular sensory equipment, is processed through something it's felt, you know.
Mm. Hmm. It's kind of like, I mean, the creative process, right?
Yes, yes, exactly. And I think that's why, I think that's the part of it. I'm glad you said that. I'm glad you drew me into that, because I think, uh, that was something about being a sailor on sailboats, which suited the peculiarities of my nature. And I guess that's that creative thing,
And so when the sailing chapter was over, is that when you started focusing primarily on your writing, on making a living as a playwright, poet, writer, or? How did
Well,
that
it just
transition?
was, because of this sort of like what you said, this intuitive, creative thing, right? I figured if I was going to continue to be a sailor, I had to get that out of my system.
Hmm.
And I was sort of getting older, and I had to decide what I was going to do. And it was, it's not like, I mean, financially, it's certainly not much of a career. It's certainly romantic and esoteric to some degree to sail these, schooners, mostly 19th century sailing vessels. But I mean, but you're not going to pile up a lot in your IRA. And then sort of the other terms with those skills are like, I don't know, like working tugs, and I guess there are like sort of a lot of things, but like a lot of those gigs where I could, and sort of like, my class in terms of boat handling, were like, tug work where like, you're the only, I didn't really sort of relish that. I love being in the water, that struggle of being like the only black, I didn't know if I wanted to do that, and then tugboats they're just like a lot of noise, and they're not that cool. So, so what I did was I thought I would get it out of my system, and then there was a period in the late '70s where I took a break, rented a loft in Brooklyn, read a lot of books, got the trades, and put on a couple of plays.
Hmm.
Right?
What was the first
And
one?
the first one was the thing called the first one was the thing called The Last of the Sweet Talk, which was a play about all of the, which included, it traced like, the plot, of course, of Shakespeare's Othello, but it was principally the missing bedroom scenes in the play, along with the existing ones. Right?
Ah, interesting.
So it was, so so after the scene, when the dudes and all those, they said, look, hey, we don't care about him marrying your daughter. Look, we got enough problems as it is. He has to go to Cyprus. So this we got to go with it. He's the man. So he has, I don't know, a short amount of time. He has to go immediately, like the next morning or something, right? So that's the first bedroom scene that we don't see, which is he is in this room with his bride, they have not consummated anything, and he has to go to war, and Cassio has been like the intermediary, and so they do not know each other, right? So that's what I try to emphasize that scene, and then of course then he goes to Cyprus, and uh, the whole plot, with Argo has about like who was it, Rodrigo, like attacking whoever's attacking who, But anyway, we're like Cassio loses his place, and then he quiets it down, and he has to go back, to the bedroom. So that night is sort of interrupted with this sort of conflict, and then after that, the next time is, when he murders her in the bedroom, and um, that's about 48 hours.
Hmm. Okay. And that was the
You
first
know,
one, huh?
yeah, you're right. So that was, you're right, and just total bloody arrogance. I mean, I didn't want to go to theater school. I mean, at NYU a long time ago, I took a playwriting class, which the professor thought I had, talent, and actually got me a semester stint at at Villanova. But I other than that, I it was just like what I read about. So it was easy to get it started. New York, you put an ad in the trade, you do this play, and people. I had this loft in Brooklyn, which this was the plot in which I would somehow produce this place. Knew absolutely zilch, right? So um, the whole thing was, one of the things that was really very useful to me. Was that book Directors on Directing,
Hmm.
and because I didn't know anything about directing, and it was Tyrone Guthrie's essay, The Audience of One, which was just a stroke for me, because it got to be after a while overwhelming, because there was no, it was just me, running around, and, other artists in the loft and figure this poor guy is gonna like kill himself, so we better help him, and and so finally, we put this nightmare up, and it was freaking awful, man. It's just, you know, uh, although, there was a guy in the Amsterdam News who really reviewed, who liked the idea and thought the attempt was verse and whatever. He actually said that, like, I needed another director, and he was certainly partly right, but I was the only director I had, the only one I could afford. So, but I sort of learned a lot. It was like, well, it was a huge learning lesson, right? And um, so the principal conclusion I came out of, so people that were there were a couple of people that said, hey, man, wow, we should do that again, man. We should do something else, like, I said, well, that kind of thing. So I said, what the hell, get this thing out of my system. So, of course, not really knowing much about acting either, of course I couldn't direct it. But one thing was sort of clear to me, that like the attitude towards Shakespeare was clearly a problem, because part of the thing that was awful was the acting, just the like acting out the gesticulation and, what people thought Shakespeare was. And I mean, one guy had one line, he was, Ludvigo, when they discover all the dead bodies, in the bedroom afterwards, and he says like, oh, bloody horror. I can't imagine somebody like mess up 3 words, what I mean? I mean, yeah, that signified my sense of failure every night when I would like say, oh God, he's gonna say it. So so I said, okay, I would write another play. And my idea was, if I wrote a play in which there were so many things to actually do, activities that people wouldn't be able to, like, gesticulate, or, like, it would calm down the acting thing, right? And there was a play called Smithers and Snipe, and it was about these two Smithers and Snipe, these 2 white guys who were played by 2 brothers in black and whiteface, in night show, and they were going to dig up a body in a graveyard and perform a ceremony for the wife of the deceased. Well, actually, but she was only one of the wives of the deceased. The guy was a bigamist, and he died with the other wife, and this wife, all she has left is to dig him up and look in his face and give him a piece of her mind. That's sort of kind of like what it intends. And so the play, really the plot of the play is like sort of like a 1-scene play, is the oppression between these 2 white guys, Smithers and Snipe, using this black woman and this black guy in a coffin, as sort of impetus to get this guy to do whatever he wants, and call him a sort of and I guess it sort of comes from and I guess it's pretty much as a black person, from my feeling about all of these which are, not so much now, but these extremely popular comedy teams, Abbott and Costello, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis and stuff like that, where one guy always gets a foot up on the basis of this sort of fabricated, friendship. He always gets the girl, it's really, one guy really mostly screwing over the guy. It's really like a cavalcade of American oppression, which happens in comedies. So anyway, this play was, very successful. It was, extremely, I actually learned a lot. It was extremely funny because So the whole thing between these two guys is that like Snide is trying to beat Smith out of money, you know what I mean? And he's saying, well, black people don't believe that bitch, whatever, whatever it is. And he pretty like sort of drive this guy, through this until some time in the play he finds. But one of the things is it was the first thing was that we were dealing with and conceiving the production was the body, right? So I asked my friend Hank, who was also a puppeteer, well, can we make a dummy for the body? And he said, why would you use a dummy when I'm a mime, right? And so I said, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. And then once we did that, I mean, the whole thing just kind of exploded, because they get into an argument about money, and then Smithers challenges Snide's logic about why carrying around the body in a coffin is any different from carrying it around in a sack, And so anyway, so Snide just guilt trips Smithers into like stuffing his body in the sack. And when you stuff a body that's a mime in the sack, Hank had thought about what levels of rigor mortis and stuff like that. And so it was just hilarious. And it was like a moment. So anyway, that's I think those were our two major productions. It was called the Laughing Mirror Theater Company.
The
Laughing Mirror Theater Company.
I see, Laughing Mirror Theater Company.
And
So
then
from the
from
Laughing,
that,
go ahead.
yeah, from that, I wrote Little Tommy Parker.
Uh-huh. Which was first done at Penumbra Theater, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it was a while before that, but that eventually became the play that, maybe it started my career. Yeah.
Wow. And so you tend to lean back towards history in most of your plays. Most of your plays have to do with historical figures, moments in history. Certainly my introduction to you was we worked on a workshop of your play Buffalo Hair about the
Yeah.
Buffalo Soldiers, and then the Big Blue Nail about Matthew Henson and William Perry and who really discovered the North Pole. And what is it about history that pulls you so deeply into those worlds?
Well, I guess for one thing, all those years working on, 19th century sailing boats.
Huh. So
Um,
there's a connection.
right. Yeah, there's a sort of like a window and sort of
Mm,
like a 19th century frame of mind, I think. And um, the boats are sort of like, really romantic and stuff. And there's a lot written about, how they're constructed. But, ship management is really an apprenticeship kind of job. It's like really, it's an experiential sort of thing. And so people pay for these ships to be built in certain areas, and we have to figure out, how they work, how they run, because it's not really recorded in that way.
what?
So you tend to think about like, well, how do those guys do that? You know what I mean? When they
Mm.
got in a situation like, well, how did you? Whoa, this is pretty heavy stuff. How did they know that? So
So let's delve a little bit into this whole idea of what classical theater is, classical writing, classical literature. Since we, at American Players Theater, that's what we focus on, and we're at a point now where we're looking at what it means to redefine that. Who makes a decision about what is deemed classical, what is poetic? And you gave a lecture at Oregon Shakespeare Festival, right? A while
yeah,
back. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read just a little excerpt of that because it kind of leans into a lot of the things that I have been grappling with and trying to get artistic directors, college professors to look at what it means to call something classical, but then to have actors of color, students, African American actors, uh, do this stuff in school that doesn't necessarily speak to their experience, how we sometimes have to develop another muscle that other students don't. So if you don't mind, before we talk a little bit about what your idea of classical writing is, I'd love to just read what you wrote here. Is that okay?
Sure, of course.
Right. Um, you said, quote, I believe that all actors training is culturally based. What the actor is doing is trying to inhabit the archetypical persona of his or her culture. For African American actors in American acting conservatories, where the Western canon and Western aesthetics are the basis for training and discourse, there is a chasm that separates the African American actor from his or her true potential because the African American in American society is both part and not a part of the culture. This paradox is the dilemma that is at the root of American identity, race relations, and our social and political history. As an African American playwright, I feel that it is my duty and responsibility to create plays and roles that compensate for the lack of our own conservatories, to shape opportunities for African American actors to inhabit more than handkerchief head stereotypes and the usual urban suspects, but rather to reveal to all the deeper resources of our culture and our contributions to our national identity and to humanity. I mean, that could be like inscribed on the outside of a building, man. That is so just etched in stone, at least for me personally. Can you talk a little bit about what led you to this lecture and just kind of your thoughts, not just about African Americans in American conservatories as young people, but about this idea of what makes something classical, what makes something poetic. It's a tricky question, I know.
Oh yeah, no. Well, it's like totally fraught, and
Hmm.
and I don't know if I have the answer. I mean, the work I do is material that I'm like attracted to, and of course, um, I believe that. I believe that as a playwright, it's my kind of obligation to create roles to compensate for the fact that we don't have conservatories. I mean, that's why the African Company. But I think in the essay that sort of explains to me, like, well, what is classical? I mean, I don't even really know, certainly, like, what that means. But in the case of the African Company, um, these Africans in 1821, in the play The African Company, and they were Africans. They weren't, they barely became Negroes yet. You know what I mean? They were Africans, right? If they had any collective identity at all, it was like an African.
Hmm.
They couldn't practice their past practices if they remembered it, right? I mean, they were people where culture was denied them, right? Whatever past they had was denied them, and whatever present culture right? So
Hmm.
what are they going to do? They're going to do what's natural to people. Spiders make webs, bees make honey, people make culture, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And they're making that culture in opposition,
Hmm.
right? Right. So it's like a David and Goliath story. That's the way we are, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
The story of a great story, we'll get to classical again, but a great story is a story that is remembered and retold because it's a lesson for us of human possibility.
Hmm.
So if you look at the history of Black people, then you got that going on. I mean, we are just filled with great stories,
Hmm.
right? I mean, you got a brother who escaped from slavery by delivering himself in a box, right? Or the couple, the slave I forget their names again, the slave couple who, the wife, you know, who was the timid one, was so light skinned. She disguised herself as a white man and took her husband as a slave. I mean, you know, talk about like, you know, messing around with gender. I mean, we've been there and done that, right? And I mean, there is, I mean, if you talk about history in terms of a reservoir of great stories, I could never live enough again, to begin to tell them all, right? So, just like we're talking. So, but what makes it classical? Well, I'll say this: that since the George Floyd thing, a lot of my work has gotten some currency, and I've been, having, discussions on Zoom just about that, and I guess the thing that I could say affirmative is that people are like grappling with that, right? I had a conversation, a really interesting conversation with a class of young people in the classical acting program at Georgetown University, that's connected with the Shakespeare Theater. And they were sort of grappling with that question. They had found this play of mine, again, about Othello.
Was it Georgetown or George Washington?
George Washington. Yeah, right. Yeah, George Washington University. And the Masks of Othello.
Yes.
Right. So they were, which kind of sort of explores that in terms of what is classical acting, going like through time. And I don't know, I've sort of developed some ideas about that. When you think of those 19th century theaters, and bad acoustics, thick curtains that absorb the sound, terrible lights. I mean, like what, if they had gas lights or candle lights and stuff like that. So like indoor theater was, big houses, so naturally, someone's going to say, no, it's the hour of discontent. That might not have been bad acting. That just might have been like, responding to the circumstances in which you're performing.
Right.
Like with the flickering lights, it must have been like looking like a movie. So maybe you, hold a pause, like, Japanese mime, in order for people to hear what you're saying, in these sort of like kind of dense places. So I guess sort of the question is the manner of performance what makes it classical? Or is it the text that make it classical? Or is it, like it's a cultural thing? It's like, well, it's because it's my people, that kind of like, makes it classical. I mean, I don't know.
The traditional kind of idea or definition of what that is, classical, certainly didn't include our culture, at least not from a Western perspective.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And like I've been to like, workshops, where there, African playwrights are in a dramaturgical situation, with white people are the running the thing, and so, like Shakespeare, a lot of like, African work, the way in which people communicate, to the audience, is like in a very sort of like direct way, it's like they're facing the audience all the time. I mean, there's not a lot of subtext, right? And and sort of some of the white directors and dramaturgs were, wanting this, I mean, when I was in Africa, I saw a play, and this is why it was classical to me. It was a play called Utugu, and it was in Freetown in 1981. And martial law had been declared, right? And this play was about the youth, right? And it's about this one kid, Utugu, who he kills a man because his sister was this man's sugar daddy, and he got her pregnant, right? And insisted she have abortion, and she died, right? So when that part of the play happened, this was in Freetown, Sierra Leone. When that part of the play happened, this woman jumped up, and she was like regaling her daughter who was sitting next to her, and she said, "You see what could happen to you," And I'm going, Jesus, this is some live theater going on here, man. This is like sort of live in the way it's directed. And I would say that the play was long, the character development, wasn't very good, a lot of things that you could say that were like dramaturgically problematic with the script. But in that theater, it didn't make any difference. Right? The way in which, in that moment, that playwright had communed and united with that audience just made me shamelessly jealous of that level of connection. Right? So, I mean, trying to know. I mean, I like classical stuff, like the Negro Peter the Great, that is and I guess that's classical. I guess in some ways I try to make it an accurate historical reenactment where the people who sound plausibly, like 17th century people that lived in that world.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the discussion. I don't know if that's something that like I want to do it myself, but like I said, well, again, like, this having these conversations. I just recently had a conversation with a class at Juilliard that just did the African conversation, right? And then also like at sort of Red Bull Theater. And one of the things that I got was that, particularly the one at the Red Bull Theater, where this one actor said that he just wondered what his life would be like if he knew when he started his acting career that there was a James Hewlett and there was a Jimmy Brown, And he said, I didn't know anything about those guys, that they were like predecessors who had paved the way for me. When I talked to the Juilliard students, I asked this, I asked this young guy who played Billy Brown, I said, you are the most, arrogant, wise ass Billy Brown, really that I've ever seen. I mean, I asked to like kind of talk to them because their take on the play was like so fresh. I mean, it was so clearly ripped right out of the moment out of like young people, starting off exactly like sort of what you're talking to, and they found fuel. It was like about people like them grappling with things that they grappled with, and they were intelligent and they translated it now. Jesus, they went into that thing, hook, line, and sinker. I mean, I was watching this shit. I forgot who wrote it, but but the guy who played Billy Brown, I asked him like, why? How did you, come upon that approach that you took? And he said that I just thought that when you looked at history and like Billy Brown and the way he was with his community and the world and stuff like that, like we wouldn't see another guy like him for another 50 years. And I don't know if that's totally true, but I went like, wow, So just sort of like that, all of that focus on something that sort of reveals, well, it's the same thing that we're talking the article. I mean, I might get sort of articulated about it, but it's something that they can really own and takes them to the next level as actors, right? They could like know that there's some other stuff in there,
Hmm.
you know, that they're not always getting out of class, that there's more, you know,
Right.
by just simply exploring their own narratives.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty heavy, that that just where we are right now as a country, and what is happening with our young people. There seems to be, I mean, at least in my lifetime, a new sense of urgency and a new sense of resistance to what has been laid down as the status quo, as the way things should be, you know, for decades. And ironically and tragically enough, it has come out of, from my perspective, a lot of what has happened recently, from George Floyd, and with what is going on, and post George Floyd. I just at least for me, I've felt something different than anything I felt before, and not just
Indeed.
among African Americans, but just among Americans,
Yeah.
which um, which is interesting.
Yeah. And I think that's really interesting why people are like really, you know, asking these questions now. I mean, I mean, we've been in theater for years. I mean, these ideas was, they were not to be questioned. They were sacrosanct, you know, and so people are, asking questions, in a really humble way, and said, well, wow, I have to tell people, it's like, you shouldn't feel bad, because if you haven't thought about it, then, there's no reason to have thoughts about it. You know what I mean? But we kind of have to have these, dialogues, but on a level of, again, getting, I mean, that's sort of the impact of what we think of classical. But on the other level is, I think, um, there's something about classical that's like, it's remembered and it's retold, because it has, some resonance in a lot of ways. And of course, that kind of can change over time. But for me, um, playwriting is a really different kind of writing, because it starts off with the idea that it's going to be communal, right? It's like even a film script or a novel and stuff like that. It's an audience of like one. In the theater, it's like an audience of many, and we go to some degree of trouble to experience it. We got like turn around, we got, or at least when there's no pandemic, we got to get dressed and get babysitters and sort of whatever. It is, by its nature, a special occasion, right? And I think it revisits us, in us, that anthropomorphic thing, we've been doing ever since we get organized, for us to collect and, get a grip or exchange information or things that, like, are essential. How did Willie kill that bison? You know what I mean? And Willie gets to that, what up there? I mean, that, like,
Right.
this is, this kind of getting together is, in a way, about survival, right? So, so I think it touches back in there. We're all there and stuff like that. And then we all, do some kind of pretty amazing thing. A group of people, collectively, I mean, not individually, but it ends up being collectively, uh, surrenders the suspension of disbelief,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And you walk out on stage, you know, and then there's just some shit that happens that just doesn't happen anywhere else. There's an
Right.
exchange of stuff. You know
Right.
what that is. You feel it. They
Yeah.
feel it. You know what I mean? And all we know is real, right? And the challenge there is it's like a perfect moment. All we can do is screw it up, right? So, I feel that those things should be heightened. That when you come on stage, you should be a king, or maybe not a king, but like a king. I mean, you should be bigger, right,
Yeah.
than us, right?
Yeah.
And when you speak, it should be clear and believable, and we should trust you, even if you're lying to us or whatever. I mean,
Right.
that world.
Speak the speech, I pray you. Right.
Yeah, 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 exactly. That world, right?
Yeah.
So, I think that there's some theater that doesn't even bother with that, right? And just
Mm,
takes that like for granted
mm,
that you come in here, and those kind of things happen anyway, and they enjoy it in a certain sense, you know. But then there's other theater, certainly it's the theater that I try to make, that those kinds of ancient things um, are gifts to the
yes,
playwright. They're like
yes,
the suspension of belief,
mm,
and they're also the writer's palette,
yes,
right? You
yeah,
know, I mean, because when you come on there, the first thing is they surrender the suspension of disbelief. It's a big gift. It's more important than the ticket price, right?
mm,
Right, and
mm,
um, you know, you're gonna honor that. You know, like if we start off and there's a chair sitting there, and I ask them, and we somehow ask them, it's not a chair, that's really a throne. They'll do that for us, right?
right, right,
You know,
amen.
just go around and make that anything else other than a throne after that, you know, unless we have decent cause. So, you know, I
Right,
think part of that is the covenant and not really making assumptions about
mm,
and keeping in place the, you know, I mean, what many of us enjoy, the ritual history, you know,
right,
of the theater.
right,
You know, so I
yeah,
guess I would lobby for that as a
hmm,
partial definition of classical.
amen. Well, on that wonderfully poetic note, my poet friend, we're going to have to bring this one to a close. But since we're talking about storytelling and the retelling of stories and what makes something classical, uh, I would love to read and close on a little excerpt from Are You Now or Have You Ever Been, which is, for our audience members who don't know, is a play that Carlyle wrote about Langston Hughes. Takes place, the first half takes place on the eve of his appearing before McCarthy and his committee on un-American activities, and then the second half shows Langston in front of the committee. But he's speaking to his audience, to his readers in this section, about why fiction is so important. And I think this really reflects, I think, what we are trying to do and to continue a tradition of in American players. So I would love to read this from Are You Now or Have You Ever Been? Langston Hughes says, Look, what I'm trying to say to you is that fiction is essential. It's not frivolity, it's not entertainment, it's not just the way you pass through leisure moments in your life. It is life. Stories are the keys to life. They are the means to our survival, roadmaps into our very being. Why? Because we cannot do this alone. We must have some record of those who have gone before us. Otherwise, we are just treading water, spinning our wheels all over and over again. The future. The future is where stories lead, spreading throughout the world. To see the future, to know it, to believe in it, to stand in a place where it will make you safe and safe for the generations that follow behind us, fiction is essential. You think I'm exaggerating? Well, let me tell you something. If you look at history, when the writers go, that's where society begins to unravel. We are the canaries in the coal mine. Socrates, Voltaire, Lorca, Thomas Mann, all were the first to go, and now it's happening here in the good old US of A. It's always the same old thing. There's a group of people who want power, and they'll do anything within their power to get it. First, they get an idea, and they call that idea good. And if you're good, then you'll follow that idea. And if you're not good, then you must be evil. You must be following a bad idea. Today it's communism, tomorrow it will be something else. The point is that for people in power, there must only be two ideas, the right one and the wrong one. And heaven help you if you should have some other ideas or your own idea, or that there should be inquiry and discourse. Then you have put yourself outside the good idea. Don't fool yourself. When they come for the writers, you could be next. When we did that, Carlisle, as part of our Zoom reading series this past summer, that that chunk right there is what stood out so much to a lot of my fellow actors and artists here at American Players, because that's at the core of it. That's at the heart of everything we've been talking about. When prehistoric man started telling stories, you know what I'm saying? And this story got passed down from this generation to that generation. And I think what you said earlier is really on point, which is that I think if it's told and retold, and there's a need for it to be retold, and there's an immediacy and a willingness to, like you said, suspend your disbelief and immerse yourself in this world only to leave the space fuller than when you entered, that's classical. That's for me, at least.
Yeah.
So, brother man, thank you so much for taking some time. I mean, we could go on forever.
Yeah, we
there's so
could.
much
I would
more.
like the audience to know that, yes, that like many times you have played Langston to great acclaim. So I can
Langston and
really.
Simon Cato, they paid my bills for many for many years. I also want to just let our audiences know that you are currently an Andrew W. Mellon playwright in residence at Illusion Theater. Yet another one of the many accolades and achievements that you have. So thank you, man.
Thank you, sir.
As
Thank
always,
you.
give my love to Barb, and hope
I
to see
will.
you in person sooner than later.
Yeah. It looks like we're on the road to that. I'm really looking forward to it.
All
Thank
right,
you, brother.
brother. Take care.
Bye bye.
All right.